Australian universities have been quietly closing Chinese government-linked education centres, 2 years after the government signalled it wouldn't allow any more of them to open on Australian campuses. The ABC has revealed that 6 controversial Confucius Institutes have been shut in recent years in the wake of increased government scrutiny and allegations that they were pushing narratives. Our Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us now from Sydney. Stephen, what are Confucius Institutes and how long have they been operating in Australia?
Well, Gemma, Confucius Institutes are basically tools of soft power. They teach things like Chinese language, Chinese culture, and ever since around 2000 or just after, they've been popping up on Australian campuses and in some instances have been teaching in Australian schools as well. Now, at their absolute height, there were some 13 Confucius Institutes in Australian universities teaching a whole variety of things, not just things like language and culture, but also the way that language can be used to help Chinese tourists, for example. Now, they were, and this is important, also funded, at least in part, by the Chinese government. Up until about 5 years ago, they were effectively run by the Chinese Education Ministry in conjunction with Australian and Chinese universities. And that, of course, Gemma, is the nub of the problem here. Increasingly, the Australian government, particularly over the last 5 years or so, has been suspicious of Confucius Institutes, worried that they're being used to push pro-Beijing narratives, worried in some instances that they may be used to keep an eye on Chinese students on Australian campuses. And what the government's done, particularly over the last couple of years, is essentially say, look, we're not going to close the existing institutes, but we are going to make it very clear that we're not going to permit any more to be opened on Australian campuses. On top of that, you've also seen more of these institutes subjected to stricter and more severe scrutiny. So, for example, in some instances, they've been forced to, register on the Foreign Influence and Transparency Scheme and the like. So you have seen increased government attention on these institutes, and more recently what the ABC's discovered is that many of these institutes are quietly closing. So from 13 back in 2020, you're now down to 7. 6 universities have quietly allowed these institutes to wrap up business on their campuses, and that is at least in part because of these concerns around government scrutiny, but also around foreign interference.
So tell us a bit more about that. I mean, how the government has responded to these concerns and what exactly is happening with these institutes.
Well, we've gone to all those universities that are running Confucius Institutes and asked them, are you going to continue to run these things? And if you're going to close them, or if you have closed them, why? Now, interestingly, none of these universities have said that they've closed these institutes because of foreign interference. That's not surprising. Universities, of course, are heavily reliant on overseas students for income. The last thing that they want to do is pick a fight publicly with the Chinese government. But many of them, for example, have cited things like COVID-19, financial pressures and the rest as the reason for these closures. In some instances, they've been totally silent about exactly why they did what they did. In some instances, they've simply said, look, we've got other programs providing things like Chinese language education, so there's no need for these Confucius Institutes to be run out of our campus anymore. You can see, broadly speaking, for many universities, Gemma, these institutes have become simply a problem that they don't need to have. There's a feeling amongst some in the sector that the scrutiny, the attention and the controversy isn't worth the candle, and I think that's why many of these, but I should add, not all, but many of these universities have decided to shut down these institutes.
And so, Stephen, for the remaining 7, are they likely to stay open, or do you think they will shut their doors as well?
Look, Jim, it's difficult to say for certain. At least some of these institutes may well similarly be closed down when their contracts come up for renewal. Many other universities may make the same calculation that those who have shut down have done. But it's also possible that some of those universities that are still running Confucius Institutes don't want to lose a valuable source of revenue, particularly given that universities are now also facing pressure on the Trump administration front, with the administration cutting funding across the board to many invaluable research projects. The federal government has also made it increasingly clear that it's not a bottomless pit of funding. So in that circumstance, many universities, particularly perhaps smaller universities, which now host the bulk of these institutes, many of those may decide that it's worth the risk and that they'll continue to take the money and continue to run these institutes.